beauty, welcome back to my channel. This video is going to be a little bit strange because I'm doing a read along of Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I started doing this read along in April 2017. We're up to installment number 5 and installment number 4 was published in April 2017. So almost 20 months ago I stopped the read alongs for this book, but people have asked me to continue, and so back by popular demand, we're going to be continuing the read-along of Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I'm not going to start the book again because those videos are still available. I'll put a link down below to the previous read-along videos. And we're just going to get started on page 37, which in this edition of the book is the beginning of chapter 6. Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. This, of course, is the first of her 7 memoirs that she published during her lifetime. So we're just going to jump right in. And of course, if you're interested in hearing me read the book from the beginning, then definitely check out the links in the description box. But we're starting on chapter 6. Reverend Thomas was the presiding elder over a district in Arkansas that included Stamps. Every 3 months, he visited our church, stayed at Mama's over the Saturday night, and preached a loud, passionate sermon on Sunday. He collected the money that had been taken in over the preceding months, heard reports from all the church groups, and shook hands with the adults and kissed all small children. Then he went away. I used to think that he went west to heaven, but Mama straightened me out. He just went to Texarkana. Bailey and I hated him unreservedly. He was ugly, fat, and he laughed like a hog with a colic. We were able to make each other burst with giggling when we did imitations of the thick-skinned preacher. Bailey was especially good at it. He could imitate Reverend Thomas right in front of Uncle Willie and never get caught because he did it soundlessly. He puffed out his cheeks until they looked like wet brown stones and wobbled his head from side to side. Only he and I knew it, but that was old Reverend Thomas to a T. His obesity, while disgusting, was not enough to incur the intense hate that we felt for him. The fact that he never bothered to remember our names was insulting, but neither was that slight alone enough to make us despise him. But the crime that tipped the scale and made our hate not only just but imperative was his actions at the dinner table. He ate the biggest, brownest, and best parts of the chicken at every Sunday meal. The only good thing about his visits was the fact that he always arrived late on Saturday nights, after we had had dinner. I often wondered if he tried to catch us at the table. I believe so, for when he reached the front porch, his little eyes would glitter toward the empty dining room and his face would fall with disappointment. Then immediately, a thin curtain would fall over his features and he'd laugh a few barks. Sister Henderson, just like a penny in a hole in it, I always turns up. Right on cue every time Mama would answer, "That's right, Elder Thomas, thank the blessed Jesus, come right in." He'd step in the front door and put down his Gladstone, that's what he called it, and look around for Bailey and me. Then he opened his awful arms and groaned, "Suffer little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven." Bailey went to him each time with his hands stretched out, ready for a manly handshake. But Reverend Thomas would push away the hand and encircle my brother for a few seconds. "You're still a boy, buddy. Remember that. They tell me the good book says, when I was a child, I spake as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things." Only then would he open his arms and release Bailey. I never had the nerve to go up to him. I was quite afraid that if I tried to say, "Hello, Reverend Thomas," I would choke on the sin of mocking him. After all, the Bible did say God is not mocked, and the man was God's representative. He used to say to me, "Come on, little sister, come and get this blessing." But I was so afraid, and I also hated him so much that my emotions mixed themselves up, and it was enough to start me crying. Mama told him time after time, "Don't pay her no mind, Elder Thomas. You know how tender-hearted she is." He ate the leftovers from our dinner, and he and Uncle Willie discussed the developments of the church programs. They talked about how the present minister was attending to his flock, who got married, who died, and how many children had been born since his last visit. Bailey and I stood like shadows in the rear of the store near the coal oil tank, waiting for the juicy parts. But when they were ready to talk about the latest scandal, Mama sent us to her bedroom with warnings to have our Sunday school lesson perfectly memorized, or we knew what we could expect. We had a system that never failed. I would sit in the big rocking chair by the stove and rock occasionally and stamp my feet. I changed voices, now soft and girlish, then a little deeper like Bailey's. Meanwhile, he would creep back into the store. Many times he came flying back to sit on the bed and hold the open lesson book just before Mama suddenly filled the doorway. "You children get your lesson good now. You know all the other children looks up to you all." Then, as she turned back into the store, Bailey followed right on her footsteps to crouch in the shadows and listen for the forbidden gossip. Once, he heard how Mr. Coley Washington had a girl from Louisville staying in his house. I didn't think that was so bad, but Bailey explained that Mr. Washington was probably doing it to her. He said that although it was bad, just about everybody in the world did it to somebody, but no one else was supposed to know that. And once, we found out about a man who had been killed by white folks and thrown into the pond. Bailey said the man's things had been cut off and put in his pocket and he had been shot in the head, all because the white folks said he did it to a white woman. Because of the kinds of news we filched from those hushed conversations, I was convinced that whenever Reverend Thomas came and Mama sent us to the back room, they were going to discuss white folks and doing it, two subjects about which I was very dim. On Sunday mornings, Mama served a breakfast that was geared to hold us quiet from 9:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. She fried thick pink slabs of home-cured ham and poured the grease over sliced red tomatoes. Eggs over easy, fried potatoes and onions, yellow hominy, and crisp perch, fried so hard we could pop them in our mouths and chew bones, fins, and all. Her cat head biscuits were at least 3 inches in diameter and 2 inches thick. The trick to eating cat heads was to get the butter on them before they got cold. Then they were delicious. When, unluckily, they were allowed to get cold, they tended to a gooiness, not unlike a wad of tired gum. We were able to reaffirm our findings on the cat heads each Sunday that Reverend Thomas spent with us. Naturally enough, he was asked to bless the table. We would all stand. My uncle, leaning his walking stick against the wall, would lean his weight on the table. Then Reverend Thomas would begin, "Blessed Father, we thank you this morning," and on and on and on. I stopped listening after a while until Bailey kicked me, and then I cracked my lids to see what had promised to be a meal that would make any Sunday proud. But as the Reverend droned on and on and on to a God who I thought must be bored to hear the same things over and over again, I saw that the ham grease had turned white on the tomatoes. The eggs had withdrawn from the edge of the platter to bunch in the center like children left out in the cold. And the cat heads had sat down on themselves with the conclusiveness of a fat woman sitting in an easy chair. And still he talked on. When he finally stopped, our appetites were gone, but he feasted on the cold food with a non-talking but still noisy relish. In the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, the children's section was on the right, catacornered from the pew that held those ominous women called the mothers of the church. In the young people's section, the benches were placed close together, and when a child's legs no longer comfortably fitted in the narrow space, it was an indication to the elders that that person could now move into the intermediate area, or center church. Bailey and I were allowed to sit with the other children only when there were informal meetings, church socials, or the like. But on the Sundays when Reverend Thomas preached, it was ordained that we occupy the first row called the mourner's bench. I thought we were placed in front because Mama was proud of us, but Bailey assured me that she just wanted to keep her grandchildren under her thumb and eye. Reverend Thomas took his text from Deuteronomy, and I was stretched between loathing his voice and wanting to listen to the sermon. Deuteronomy was my favorite book in the Bible. The laws were so absolute, so clearly set down, that I knew if a person truly wanted to avoid hell and brimstone and being roasted forever in the devil's fire, all she had to do was memorize Deuteronomy and follow its teaching, word for word. I also liked the way the word rolled off the tongue. Bailey and I sat alone on the front bench, the wooden slats pressing hard on our behinds and the backs of our thighs. I would have wriggled just a bit, but each time I looked over at Mama, she seemed to threaten, "Move and I'll tear you up." So, obedient to the unvoiced command, I sat still. The church ladies were warming up behind me with a few hallelujahs and praise the Lords and amens, and the preacher hadn't really moved into the meat of the sermon. It was going to be a hot service. On my way into church, I saw Sister Monroe, her open-faced gold crown glinting when she opened her mouth to return a neighborly greeting. She lived in the country and couldn't get to church every Sunday, so she made up for her absences by shouting so hard when she did make it that she shook the whole church. As soon as she took her seat, all the ushers would move to her side of the church because it took 3 women and sometimes a man or 2 to hold her. Once, when she hadn't been to church for a few months, she had taken off to have a child, she got the spirit and started shouting, throwing her arms around and jerking her body, so the ushers went over to hold her down, but she tore herself away from them and ran up to the pulpit. She stood in front of the altar, shaking like a freshly caught trout. She screamed at Reverend Taylor, "Preach it! I said preach it!" Naturally, he kept on preaching, as if she wasn't standing there telling him what to do. Then she screamed and extremely fierce, "I said preach it!" and stepped up on the altar. The Reverend kept on throwing out phrases like home run balls, and Sister Monroe made a quick break and grasped for him. For just a second, everything and everyone in the church, except Reverend Taylor and Sister Monroe, hung loose like stockings on a wash line. Then she caught the minister by the sleeve of his jacket and his coattail, and she rocked him from side to side. I have to say this for a minister. He never stopped giving us the lesson. The usher board made its way to the pulpit, going up both aisles with a little more haste than is customarily seen in church. Truth to tell, they fairly ran to the minister's aid. Then two of the deacons, in their shiny Sunday suits, joined the ladies in white on the pulpit, and each time they pried Sister Monroe loose from the preacher, he took another deep breath and kept on preaching. And Sister Monroe grabbed him in another place and more firmly. Reverend Taylor was helping his rescuers as much as possible by jumping around when he got a chance. His voice at one point got so low it sounded like a roll of thunder. Then Sister Monroe's "Preach it!" cut through the roar, and we all wondered, I did in any case, if it would ever end. Would they go on forever, or get tired out at last like a game of blind man's bluff that lasted too long with nobody caring who was it? I'll never know what might have happened, because magically the pandemonium spread. The Spirit infused Deacon Jackson and Sister Wilson, the chairman of the usher board, at the same time. Deacon Jackson, a tall, thin, quiet man who was also a part-time Sunday school teacher, gave a scream like a falling tree, leaned back on thin air, and punched Reverend Taylor on the arm. It must have hurt as much as it caught the Reverend unawares. There was a moment's break in the rolling sounds, and Reverend Taylor jerked around surprised and hauled off and punched Deacon Jackson. In the same second, Sister Wilson caught his thigh, looped it over her fist a few times, and pressed down on him. There wasn't time to laugh or cry before all three of them were down on the floor behind the altar, their legs spiked out like kindling wood. Sister Monroe, who had been the cause of all the excitement, walked off the dais, cool and spent, and phrased her flinty voice in the hymn. I came to Jesus as I was, worried, wounded, and sad. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad. The minister took advantage of already being on the floor and asked in a choky little voice if the church would kneel with him to offer a prayer of thanksgiving. He said we had been visited with a mighty spirit, and let the whole church say amen. On the next Sunday, he took his text from the 18th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Luke and talked quietly but seriously about the Pharisees who prayed in the streets so that the public would be impressed with their religious devotion. I doubt that anyone got the message, certainly not those to whom it was directed. The deacon board, however, did appropriate funds for him to buy a new suit. The other was a total loss. Our presiding elder had heard the story of Reverend Taylor and Sister Monroe, but I was sure he didn't know her by sight. So my interest in the service's potential and my aversion to Reverend Thomas caused me to turn him off. Turning off or tuning out people was my highly developed art. The custom of letting obedient children be seen but not heard was so agreeable to me that I went one step further. Obedient children should not see or hear if they chose not to do so. I laid a handful of attention on my face and tuned up the sounds in the church. Sister Monroe's fuse was already lit, and she sizzled somewhere to the right behind me. Elder Thomas jumped into the sermon, determined, I suppose, to give the members what they came for. I saw the ushers from the left side of the church near the big windows begin to move discreetly like pallbearers towards Sister Monroe's bench. Bailey jogged my knee. When the incident with Sister Monroe, which we always called simply the incident, had taken place, we had been too astounded to laugh. But for weeks after, all we needed to send us into violent outbursts of laughter was a whispered, "Preach it." Anyway, he pushed my knee, covered his mouth, and whispered, "I said, preach it." I looked toward Mama, across that square of stained boards over the collection table, hoping that a look from her would root me safely to my sanity. But for the first time in memory, Mama was staring behind me at Sister Monroe. I suppose she was counting on bringing that emotional lady up short with a severe look or two. But Sister Monroe's voice had already reached the danger point. "Preach it!" There were a few smothered giggles from the children's section, and Bailey nudged me again. "I said, preach it," in a whisper. Sister Monroe echoed him loudly. "I said, preach it!" Two deacons wedged themselves around Brother Jackson as a preventative measure, and two large, determined-looking men walked down the aisle towards Sister Monroe. While the sounds in the church were increasing, Elder Thomas made the regrettable mistake of increasing his volume too. Then suddenly, like a summer rain, Sister Monroe broke through the cloud of people trying to hem her in and flooded up the pulpit. She didn't stop this time, but continued immediately to the altar, bound for Elder Thomas, crying, "I said, preach it!" Bailey said out loud, hot dog, and damn, and she's gonna beat his butt. But Reverend Thomas didn't intend to wait for that eventuality. So as Sister Monroe approached the pulpit from the right, he started descending from the left. He was not intimidated by his change of venue. He continued preaching and moving. He finally stopped right in front of the collection table, which put him almost in our laps, and Sister Monroe rounded the altar on his heels, followed by the deacons, ushered, some unofficial members, and a few of the bigger children. Just as the elder opened his mouth, pink tongue waving, and said, "Great God of Mount Nebo," Sister Monroe hit him on the back of his head with her purse, twice. Before he could bring his lips together, his teeth fell. No, actually his teeth jumped out of his mouth. The grinning uppers and lowers lay by my right shoe, looking empty and at the same time appearing to contain all the emptiness in the world. I could have stretched out a foot and kicked them onto the bench or behind the collection table. Sister Monroe was struggling with his coat, and the men had all but picked her up to remove her from the building. Bailey pinched me and said without moving his lips, "I'd like to see him eat dinner now." I looked at Reverend Thomas desperately. If he appeared just a little sad or embarrassed, I could feel sorry for him and wouldn't be able to laugh. My sympathy for him would keep me from laughing. I dreaded laughing in church. If I lost control, two things were certain to happen. I would surely pee, and I would just as surely get a whipping. And this time, I would probably die because everything was funny. Sister Monroe and Mama trying to keep her quiet with those threatening looks, and Bailey whispering, "Preach it," and Elder Thomas with his lips flapping loose like tired elastic. But Reverend Thomas shrugged off Sister Monroe's weakling clutch, pulled out an extra large white handkerchief and spread it over his nasty little teeth. Putting them in his pocket, he gummed, "Naked I come into the world, and naked I shall go out." Bailey's laugh had worked its way up through his body and was escaping through his nose in short, hoarse snorts. I didn't try any longer to hold back the laugh. I just opened my mouth and released sound. I heard the first titter jump in the air over my head, over the pulpit and out the window. Mama said out loud, "Sister!" But the bench was greasy and I slid off onto the floor. There was more laughter in me trying to get out. It didn't know there was that much in the whole world. It pressed at all my body openings, forcing everything in its path. I cried and hollered, passing gas and urine. I didn't see Bailey descend on the floor, but I rolled over once and he was kicking and screaming too. Each time we looked at each other, we howled louder than before. And though he tried to say something, the laughter attacked him and he was only able to get out, "I said, preach." And then I rolled over onto Uncle Willie's rubber-tipped cane. My eyes followed the cane up to his good brown hand on the curve and up the long, long white sleeve to his face. The one side pulled down as it usually did when he cried. It also pulled down when he laughed. He stuttered, "I'm going to whip you this time myself." I have no memory of how we got out of church and into the parsonage next door, but in that overstuffed parlor, Bailey and I received the whipping of our lives. Uncle Willie ordered us between licks to stop crying. I tried to, but Bailey refused to cooperate. Later, he explained that when a person is beating you, you should scream as loud as possible. Maybe the whipper will become embarrassed, or else some sympathetic soul might come to your rescue. Our Savior came for neither of these reasons. But because Bailey yelled so loud and disturbed what was left of the service, the minister's wife came out and asked Uncle Willie to quiet us down. Laughter so easily turns to hysteria for imaginative children. I felt for weeks after that I had been very, very sick, and until I completely recovered my strength, I stood on laughter's cliff, and any funny thing could hurl me off to my death far below. Each time Bailey said, "Preach it," to me, I hit him as hard as I could and cried. That's the end of chapter 6. I'll make another video where I read chapter 7. I hope you'll join me for more of this read along. Of course, go ahead and link in the description box to previous videos, and this video will also go in the link for the upcoming videos. Thanks for reading, thanks for watching, thanks for reading along with me, and leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you're reading along and if you're enjoying this, and if this read along made you want to pick up the physical book and read it yourself. So thanks for watching. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll talk in the comments. So until next time, happy reading, happy listening. Bye.